Hi, I'm Ken Shank, and I'm about to commit philosophical sacrilege in revealing my long held opinion that Socrates was, in fact, yes, an idiot. Now, that's not going to get me very far, is it? This is the first in a series of videos I'm doing this summer on the great ideas. And even though I think Socrates was an idiot, I can't think of any place that is better to start a Western philosophical journey than with what is called Plato's Apology. Now, as I'll say in a second, an apology in Greek is not, I'm sorry. That's not what an apology is. An apology, apologia in Greek, is a defense. And the Plato's Apology is basically the trial of Socrates. Socrates was condemned in 399 BCE and commanded to drink hemlock, which he willingly did, which is, you can decide whether you think that was idiotic or not. He had opportunities to escape. His followers, in fact, the apology is followed by the Credo and the Phaedo. And in the Credo, Plato's followers try to convince him to leave town. It'll be easy. We can bribe the guard. Sparta will take you, and Socrates refuses to not die. Or you can decide whether he is noble. There is a certain nobility to that. And of course, in a way, he's the father of Western philosophy. I mean, it is hard to imagine what would have happened, or rather, what would have not happened in the philosophical tradition if Socrates hadn't died, the first martyr for philosophy, some people say. There is a great deal of value that has been bequeathed to us as a result of this martyrdom of Socrates, principally because of Plato. Plato was a young man at the time. He wasn't one of the chief followers of Socrates, but he was there. He paints himself there in this document, in this treatise, this dialogue, as it were. And so Plato was around. He clearly was very impressed upon by Socrates. And Plato would go on to become probably the greatest ancient philosopher before Augustine. So there's a greatness here that comes out of Socrates, but you can decide whether he was an idiot or not for not leaving town. We'll talk about that in a second. Well, let me give you, first of all, the basic story, the background story of Socrates here. So according to Socrates, the story begins when a friend of him goes to the Oracle of Delphi, and you can go there still today. Of course, there's no oracle there anymore. It was a priestess who sat over a crack of the earth. Some have suggested that she might have been high, but she was mediating the voice of the god Apollo, who is the god of prophecy, as it were. And a lot of times what she would say would be ambiguous, things like, go to war and you'll get a big surprise, and whether you win or lose, surprise. But apparently, according to Plato's version of the story, the friend goes to the oracle and says, is Socrates the wisest man alive? Or who is the wisest man alive? And the priestess says, why, Socrates. And according to Plato's version of the story, by the way, in Xenophon's version of the story, the oracle doesn't exactly say he's the wisest man alive. It says he's very smart and some very positive things about him. But Plato records the verdict being that he's the wisest man alive. And his reaction is, why, little old me? I'm not the wisest man alive. Surely I'm not. And then he then goes around asking people. And the way he presents it, and this is one of the reasons why I'm saying that Socrates is an idiot, he then takes it as a divine command to go around annoying everybody by exposing the fact that they're not nearly as smart as they think they are. Well, this is not going to make friends for you. If you go around important people, politicians, artists, craftsmen, go around basically making them look like a fool, well, yes, of course, young people are going to hang around to watch the sport, but also you're going to accrue a lot of enemies. And this is part of why I have a feeling, and I could be wrong, that Socrates was one of those kind of annoying people that liked, now he says, I realized, and this is a good takeaway, I realized that I was wiser because I at least knew that I was ignorant. That's one of the takeaways of this dialogue, is to realize that there's a certain wisdom in realizing that you don't know as much as you might think you know. That is wisdom. That is a good takeaway from Plato's Apology. However, I am deeply suspicious as to whether Socrates actually felt that way. I have a feeling that Socrates actually did think he was smarter than everybody. Again, maybe I'm wrong. Socrates fits into a type of person that I've encountered numerous times over the years. This is the kind of know-it-all who enjoys questions for question's sake. In other words, they don't ask questions to get to truth. They ask questions to kind of knock you down. And there are actually some Christian apologists. By the way, you may have heard of the phrase apologetics. Apologetics is the field of philosophy that defends the Christian faith. I heard a story once of a Christian apologist, a well-known name that I could mention, who debated an atheist and made the atheist look completely stupid. And so there's no question from the story that was relayed to me that the Christian apologists certainly ended up looking smarter and certainly ended up looking as if their questions exposed the stupidity of this dumb atheist. And so it looked like the Christian won the debate. But my friend who was at that debate overheard two people as they were walking out say, well, clearly the Christian won that debate. But if that's the kind of attitude Christians have, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And to broaden this beyond Christianity, there's a certain type of people that is a kind of intellectual show-off that likes unraveling other people's arguments and likes making other people look stupid and likes asking questions that make them look smart. I don't have any time at all for that type of person. And again, perhaps I'm maligning Socrates. Please forgive me, Socrates, if I'm maligning you. But the picture I get of Socrates, even from this defense he makes, in which he promises, I will go on needling all of you and asking you questions. I will go on hammering you with questions that you obviously can't answer. That's kind of the feel that I get when I read Plato's Apology. And I just don't have any interest in that type of approach. Questions are good because questions hopefully will lead us closer to the truth. Questions for their own sake, I'm not sure there's much room for that. And this is what Socrates apparently did. He didn't work very much. In fact, as I read the Apology, he apparently didn't support his children. He chose to die rather than live. Plato could have lived. He could have survived this, as I said. And yet he had two young children that he basically left fatherless because he wasn't willing to humble himself or maybe to find another way. And this is a problem. Plato and Socrates, at least as he's depicted here, are what we might call absolutists. And there are a lot of circles where absolutism is a very positive term. But absolutism, when it means I'm not willing to meet somebody in the middle, or when absolutism translates into a kind of stubbornness where I'm not going to budge, I'm going to make you do all the budging, and I'm going to make you come to me, and I'm not going to make any effort whatsoever to find a middle ground or to find peace. That kind of absolutism actually is harmful to society. It's not helpful at all. Now, there's a time, don't get me wrong, there's a time where you say, here I stand, I shall do no other, as Martin Luther said, or Athanasius against the world back in the 300s. There's a time to not compromise. There is. But most of the time, meeting in the middle is the best way to go. And Socrates is an idiot because he would rather die than take care of his own family. He didn't work. He didn't provide. How did he provide for his children? He says in this dialogue that he spends all of his time going around embarrassing public officials rather than actually doing something that might put food on his children's table. And so you can see that I'm not real positive towards Socrates. I probably agree with him. It's probably in terms of the leaders of Athens probably being corrupt, them probably having bad values. They certainly seem to be stupid from his dialogues, but of course that's coming through Plato's voice. But I'm not sure that this is a helpful way to live your life. I'm going to spend the rest of my life going around trying to embarrass important people. This is what Socrates basically does. Now, what is the good in Socrates? He does model a kind of dialogical style, a question-answer style of teaching. He's not a lecturer. He doesn't just lecture like I do. He actually, well, actually in the classroom, I want to engage in question and answer. Just sometimes it's hard to get a dialogue going. But the so-called Socratic method is a method of uncovering the truth by a dialogue of questions and answer. And so you may have heard of the Socratic method. It comes from, surprise, Socrates. He was charged in this trial for corrupting the youth and for undermining Greek religion, inventing new gods that don't fit with the state gods. By the way, there, I think, is an intentional parallel in Acts 17 with the trial of Socrates. That is to say, I think that the author of Acts wants us to think of Socrates when Paul is on trial before the Areopagus. In fact, what is the Areopagus? It's the same place where Socrates was on trial, as it were. And Paul, in Acts 17, is in the same place. And what is he defending? You seem to be inventing strange gods. Well, that's the same charge that was made against Socrates. So I think the author of Acts wants Theophilus and the audience to think of Socrates when they see Paul being on trial. Of course, Paul very, very inspired and cleverly says, why, I saw an altar of the unknown God. Why, that's the God I'm talking about, the creator of all that is. In fact, the only God that actually exists. I'm not inventing new gods. Socrates, of course, again, call me cynical, but I kind of think that Socrates didn't really believe in the Greek gods. Now, we can't entirely believe the sources that are against him. In the Phaedo, it talks about his death, when he drank the hemlock and he's feeling the numbness make its way up his legs and so forth. One of his last comments is, we should sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius for my healing. In other words, I'm dying and I'm being healed, to go to a better life, afterlife. And so who knows, maybe he did believe in Asclepius. But I have a feeling that Socrates probably didn't actually believe in the gods as the Greeks conceived of them. I suspect probably that charge wasn't entirely false, just as I suspect that there were a lot of youth who became kind of prattlers who went around needling people with questions. Probably there were young people who learned the skill, and some of them probably used it for good, and some of them probably didn't. One of the reasons why Socrates is put on trial at a bad point in Greek history, because the Athenians had lost in the Peloponnesian War to the Spartans, and one of Socrates's followers, I don't know whether follower is the right word, but one person who had kind of hung around Socrates was a guy named Alcibiades. And Alcibiades betrayed the Athenians and went to the Spartan side. And the Spartans actually probably won some of their battles because of the help of Alcibiades. So Socrates, you could see where people would say, this is a bad guy. He kind of taught the guy that betrayed Athens in the Peloponnesian War, and so we need to get rid of this guy because he's bad news. Again, you could see where this was a bad time for Socrates to be put on trial. That's kind of the backstory of his trial. So Plato's Apology, again, it's an apologia. It's certainly not Socrates saying he's sorry. Socrates isn't sorry about anything. He's a stubborn old man, I would say, 70 years old. An apologia is a defense in Greek, not a apology as we use the word today. Words kind of wander in their meaning. I've already hinted at his charges. He's charged for corrupting the youth and for not believing in the gods of the city. There's not really a state, so the city gods, the polis, the gods of the polis. And of course, they think that he has taught them a devilish logic that makes the weaker argument defeat the stronger, that he's taught them how to unravel what is good. And Probably he has, but it's up to the moral responsibility of his followers as to how they use the power that he has given them. I have a mentor who I've learned immense things from over the years. And of course, those skills could be used for good and they can be used for evil. Hopefully, most of those who've learned from him have used them for good, maybe all. But anyway, we should remember that this Plato's version here is not a transcript. This is a piece of philosophy. In fact, one of the things about Plato's writings, even though Socrates is the main character in most of Plato's writings, it's really Plato we're hearing. In fact, the longer we go into Plato's writings, the writings, say, toward the end of Plato's life, are probably almost entirely Plato. It's in the earlier writings of Plato that we may actually get some of the authentic voice of Socrates. But Socrates becomes the mouthpiece for Plato the further we go. Now, the Apology is in the earlier, I think, writings of Plato. And so we probably do mostly get the authentic voice of Socrates. But we should remember that this is a piece of art. The Plato's Apology is a piece of art, even though Plato didn't like art. He was a pretty good artist, even though he didn't like it, in terms of being a writer of fiction, so to speak. But this is an artistic piece of philosophy. It's not a transcript of what happens. And as I've mentioned, there are other sources about Socrates. There's Xenophon's Apology of Socrates also, which again is much the same, but with a few differences that I've mentioned. About 30 years earlier, there was also a comedy by Aristophanes called The Clouds that makes a lot of fun of Socrates. In fact, Socrates hints in the Apology that perhaps he is on trial as much for his reputation from this play, rather than just from what he actually did. The Clouds, he is definitely depicted as somebody who is a natural philosopher who doesn't actually believe that the gods exist. He's portrayed very much like, is it Anaxagoras? I'm trying to remember whether it's Anaxagoras or Anaximenes. It's Anaxagoras, who Socrates says basically, I think you're confusing me with Anaxagoras. But again, I think probably there is some truth to the idea that Socrates was a natural philosopher who believed that the gods were basically metaphors for natural phenomena and so forth. Well, Socrates the prat. Again, maybe I'm wrong, forgive me, Socrates, but it seems to me that Socrates is the type of person, kind of person I've encountered over the years, who likes making other people feel stupid, who asks questions just to ask questions, not to get anywhere. I had one of my best friends in high school was, I felt like this, that he just liked arguments. He liked arguments for their own sake. Do you know people like this? People who you know that they're going to provoke something because that's what they do. They provoke. And there's no point to it. It's just the provocation is the sport. The sport is the argument. That's idiocy. There's no point in it. I don't like this part of Socrates as I infer him to be. And like I said, I think he probably did think he was smarter than everybody else. After all, he judges them, right? He doesn't like their answers. And so obviously he thinks, well, I can see that doesn't make any sense. And of course, it's always easier to deconstruct a position than it is to actually construct a position. Mighty convenient that Socrates doesn't claim to have any positions at all. His position is that your position is stupid. Again, idiot or prat at the very least. And I'm not sure that Socrates is always right, because he does have some positions that he assumes are right. He uses what I would call the fallacy of equivocation, where he takes a word in one sense and then flips the question by using the word in another sense. So I actually don't think Socrates is as smart as he thinks he is. But anyway, he does seem to be a little bit proud and a little bit stubborn. At least he comes across that way to me. And so while I do value some of his values, let's say the good parts, I will on the next slide. Socrates was on the council once. He was ordered to go and get a general for death because the democracy had voted that all of the generals would be tried together and punished together. and they voted for them all to die. And Socrates said, this goes against the law. According to the law, each individual must be tried individually. And therefore, I am not going to go and get this general for death because the democracy has voted against the law. It's a reminder that that the system, for example, that we have in the United States and in modern democracies, Western democracies, you can't vote out. You can't vote out the Constitution, as it were. Well, I suppose we could, but the idea is that a democracy can't vote to not have a democracy, or the majority can't vote to kill the minority. There are ground rules for a democracy, and of course, Plato wasn't a big fan of democracy. If we ever read some of the Republic, we'll have a sense he believed that society should be run by a philosopher king or kings. But enough of that for now. Maybe eventually we'll look at the Republic some. But I do get the impression that Socrates did think that he was a little bit superior to everybody else. And this type of person likes telling people off. Sometimes they think, I'm being like Jesus, I'm going to tell those people off. Or they think they're being like a prophet because they tell somebody off. But telling people off, you're stupid, doesn't actually accomplish anything. What's the value? What's the benefit? Well, I sure told them. Dale Carnegie had a great saying, a man convinced against his will is of the same mind still, that you don't actually get anywhere by just exposing the stupidity of somebody else, unless that exposure leads to change. And so I just don't have any time for people who their mode is, I'm going to sure tell them. It may make you feel good. It's actually kind of selfish. I'm sure Socrates felt pretty good to tell off those politicians, but did it change anything? And in fact, it didn't change anything. And Socrates dies because of his choice of action, which means that he's not around anymore even to tell truth to power. So these are some of the reasons why I think that although I think that Plato's Apology is the place to start, and Socrates had some good things to say, in the end, I think there was a lot of idiotic to Socrates as well. This is Raphael's School of Athens, famous painting from the Renaissance. This is Socrates here on the steps. This is Plato and Aristotle, whom I'm sure we will get to eventually. Well, having vented about how I think Socrates had a lot of idiotic aspects, let me mention some of the great concepts and great quotes that we learned from Plato's Apology. First of all, I've already mentioned the Socratic method, a great way to teach. Help lead a person to the conclusion themselves rather than just downloading it. Have a dialogue with them. The idea that Socrates was a gadfly, like the fly around a horse's patootie, that the horse's tail is always trying to swat away. There's a time for a gadfly. Absolutely. There is a time for a gadfly, as long as it's leading to change. If the gadfly is there to lead to good change, then that's the time for the gadfly, not just for its own sake. This idea that the wise person is the person who realizes that they're not wise is a great concept too. The idea that the more you know, the less you know. Great concept that comes out of Plato's Apology about Socrates. This is a great line in Plato's Apology where he basically says, look, the God has told me to go around asking people, questions. Should I obey God or should I obey you guys? This may sound familiar to those of you, again, who know the book of Acts, because in Acts chapter 4, when the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, gets Peter and John up in front of the council, what do Peter and John say? Well, you tell me whether I should obey God or whether I should obey you all. And I don't think this is a coincidence. Once again, I think that the author of Acts wants us to think of Socrates. I think there's an echo, an intentional allusion even to Socrates here, which of course Theophilus, I think, would have immediately picked up on. And one of the purposes, I think, of the book of Acts is to show that Christians are law-abiding, orderly, unified citizens. And so this allusion that, yes, they did on this particular occasion disobey the powers that be, but they were following God, just like Socrates claimed to be. And of course, Socrates would have been considered a very positive figure by that audience, not an idiot. After he is condemned to death, basically Socrates says, The unexamined life is not worth living. I'd rather not live than not be able to examine life. Now, I'm not sure that I totally agree with Socrates here. I think there are some people who aren't wired to do philosophy, and some of them are philosophers. But anyway, um, there is a time not to ask questions. There is a time simply to accept things on faith. There's a sense in which having all the proofs is not the same as faith. I don't think that reason and faith are hostile to each other, but the very idea of faith implies that there are some things that you can't reach a rational conclusion on. So I don't consider this to be an absolute, but I do personally believe, I personally would much rather examine my assumptions and have wide open eyes as I look into any issue, rather than to blindly just do whatever my assumptions I grew up with. We all grow up with these assumptions, right? We get them from our parents, we get them from school, we get them from the media, we get them from the movies we watch, we get them from the town that we grow up in. We grow up with all these unexamined assumptions. We are a slave to them, really, to start off with, because we don't see them. And so examining our assumptions is a liberating thing. It frees us up. Now, we may hold the same beliefs when we're done that we started off with, but now we know the other options. Now we hold them freely, which is why, of course, I always think that Plato's Apology is the great place to start reading through Western philosophy, because there is a liberation that happens once we begin to see ourselves, and we begin to see our assumptions, and we begin to see where we got them from, and we begin to see, oh, I didn't even realize that I was swimming in this water of my culture and its assumptions. And this is why there's a tendency for the general populace to have negative feelings toward education sometimes. It's not that education automatically makes you liberal, but what education does is it examines traditions. It exposes traditions as the eddies and currents of history often. It exposes you to the forces on you. Sometimes people don't like you to expose their ignorance. People don't like you to know more options than they know. There's a scholar by the name of Mark Knoll who teaches at Notre Dame, who wrote a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he basically pointed out how evangelicalism especially has a tendency not to want to ask questions about its assumptions. And so there's a tendency often in American culture, a hostility of the general populace toward universities, toward education, toward seminaries, cemeteries, and this sort of thing. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of blindness in universities and seminaries too. So I'm not giving a buy, because if we examine our assumptions, then we must examine the assumptions of the university. We must examine the assumptions of our discipline in the university. Nothing is off the table to the examined life. But it is perfectly predictable that there would be some animosity toward education when the education is doing what it's intended to do, which is namely open your eyes to your assumptions. Now, this is an interesting quote from the Apology. Nothing can harm a good man in either life or death. Basically, Socrates is saying that if I die and I have been a good man, then I have nothing to fear in death. Socrates does, at least in Plato's depiction of him, profess to believe in an afterlife, a positive afterlife, and he looks forward to it. He wants to ask questions to all the great heroes of the past that he's heard about. Well, this is the painting by David in the late 1700s called The Death of Socrates, where he's drunk the hemlock and he's feeling the numbness make its way through his body, or perhaps he's about to drink the hemlock. David is my favorite painter of all time for his classic portraits. Well, this has been a few of my thoughts. They may be wrong. You should examine them. You should question my thoughts here to see whether you think they hold water or not, because the unexamined video is not worth watching.